guys, welcome back to the Pulling Curls podcast. Today on episode 127, we're talking about myths, but not like Zeus. We're talking about breastfeeding myths. I bet Zeus would have loved breastfeeding myths. Let's untangle it. The curly head behind the Pulling Curls podcast, where we untangle pregnancy, parenting, home, and even travel. We know there's no right answer for every family, but hopefully we can spark some ideas that will work for yours. Life's tangled, just like my hair. Hey guys, before we get started, remember that you can subscribe. You might have found this on my website or somewhere else. Just go ahead to your favorite podcast player. I know you have one. Could it be Spotify or Stitcher or Apple Podcasts? And just hit subscribe. And huge bonus when you're there, just leave a review. Like, just what did you like about this episode? And it totally helps me talk to more people. So be sure and subscribe. Today's guest, I think it's her fourth time on the podcast. She is the Breastfeeding Mama on Instagram and TikTok. You might also know her from the website Clark's Condense. I want to introduce my friend, Katie Clark. Do you feel prepared for your delivery? In just 3 short hours, you can be prepared for the confident, collaborative delivery you want. You'll know what to expect and how to talk with your healthcare team, and there are no boring lessons in this class. I'll use humor, stories from my 20 years in the delivery room to engage both of you. I love how Alyssa told me that she found herself laughing at things that used to sound scary. Most of all, you guys are going to be on the same page from bump to bassinet. Join the online prenatal class for couples today. You can save 15% with coupon code UNTANGLED. You can find the link in the show notes. Hey, Katie, welcome to the Pulling Curls podcast.
Hi, thank you for having me again.
I know this is time number 3, I think, right? 3?
Yes, I think
4?
This is the third one. I
6?
always enjoy coming on here, so it's
No,
fun.
I think this is 4 because I think we did a while you were pregnant, and then we did an after you had your baby, and then we did a breastfeeding one. So
yeah, I think that's right. Well, I'm practically a co-host at this point.
yeah, the Katie and Hillary show. Okay, I'm so excited to talk about this because I had 100% drunk the breastfeeding myths before I had my first baby. I was just like, it will work. Like, clearly there will never be a problem because that's what I've been taught in nursing school, stupid nursing school, which now I realize that most of what I learned in nursing school was also a myth. So let's jump into breastfeeding. So what's your first myth?
There's so many myths. I would say the first one, I'll start with some that are kind of more common, like during pregnancy, where this is the biggest one, is that you should toughen up your nipples before you give birth. I think that's one that's been passed down through generations from your mom and your grandma, but it's really not a good idea. And that actually can cause more harm than good if you're in there, scrubbing your nipples and putting all these ointments and stuff on there. Your body is going to, prepare your nipples with your hormones. So that's probably one of the biggest ones I hear people say is, oh, what can I do? Do I need to toughen up my nipples before the baby's born? The only way you're going to do that is actually breastfeeding and pumping.
Yeah. I wondered after breastfeeding didn't work with Connor, I wondered if that was part of my problem. Like maybe there was something I should do to my nipples in advance. I think if you had an issue last time, you can talk to them about like if you had fibrous breast tissue, you could see a lactation consultant. I think there were a couple people that said there was something I could do. But again, I was coming from a place of like, I had a severe problem.
Yeah.
What could I do next time?
No, that's so hard when it's your first baby too. You don't know anything. You're just like, well, the baby's supposed to breastfeed. You don't know what to look for. And I think that's where a lot of times like a prenatal consult can be really helpful, especially for a brand new mom. So you can kind of go over and do like a breast exam and talk about any concerns you might have, because that is the point where if you do have an issue coming up that you may not know about, that you should definitely, you can prepare, because there are things that you can do in the future, just like there's like vitamins or blood tests and things you can do. But yeah, it's as far as like toughening up your nipples and things, that's really not something that would help in any situation.
Just get out the steel wool, get your SOS pad out.
Exactly. Another one I hear often is that if you have colostrum leaking during pregnancy, that it means you're going to have a great supply. And that if you don't have colostrum leaking, then you're not going to have any milk supply. And I've seen the opposite be true for so many people, where people are like, oh, I was leaking colostrum. But then I wasn't able to produce any milk. And then, there's people on the flip side that are like, I didn't produce any colostrum during pregnancy, and I thought for sure I wasn't going to be able to breastfeed. And then they ended up having a great supply. So I think that's one thing. People are like, oh, I see milk, or I don't see milk before. And they kind of freak out about that and think, one way or the other that breastfeeding is going to be super successful or not. And that's really not true at all.
Yep. Totally got colostrum. Complete breastfeeding loser. So we'll just break that myth right here. Yeah. Didn't matter at all.
Yep. And I think another one that goes in hand with that is that if you are leaking colostrum, like if you pump before you give birth, then you're going to be able to increase your supply. And there's really nothing you can do to increase your supply before you give birth, just because your milk doesn't start to come in larger volumes until the placenta is delivered. So anything you're doing before you give birth, that's not really going to be super beneficial for your supply after birth. You can get some colostrum and collect it for you if you want to give it to the baby after you give birth, but it's not going to make you have an amazing supply if you're pumping. And that can also put you into preterm labor. So definitely not ideal to pump even if you see milk.
Yeah. And you would be collecting it in such small amounts. I don't know how you would freeze it. It seems like a little bit of a nightmare. And like Katie said, you don't want to pump until you're at least 37 weeks for sure, because nipple stimulation could start contractions. And for all of you who are now 37 weeks and rubbing your nipples, it doesn't often put you into labor. It might bump you into labor, kind of like them stripping your membranes, but it's not going to probably somebody's touched your boob along the way and it didn't throw you into labor. So
exactly. And I think that's kind of another myth too, because there's a lot of, they say, don't do nipple stimulation, don't do anything like that. But it's really going to be a lot more intense nipple stimulation. And like you said, it's more if you're already on the process of going into labor, it might kind of push you there. So if you're at risk of preterm labor, might not be the best idea. And then with the collecting colostrum, it's you do just get drops at a time. And sometimes you can freeze those in medical syringes. They do recommend that, especially for moms that have gestational diabetes or that their babies are going to be really small or really large. You can harvest it, but it's going to be small amounts. So don't think you're going to be getting ounces and ounces of colostrum if you decide to harvest it.
Yeah, that seems like a lot of work for very little payoff. Yeah, there's much better things to do with your time.
Yes, I completely agree. And kind of speaking on the same line of colostrum, that just kind of leads into another myth that you don't have any milk when your baby's born. Because a lot of people are like, oh, well, your milk doesn't come in until day 3 or 4 or whatever. So I need to supplement before the babies, until my milk comes in. And in some situations, you might not have colostrum, your milk might be slower to come in, or you might not have larger volumes, but colostrum is milk. It's breast milk. It's just the first stage of breast milk. And we often call it the first milk. And so if you are producing colostrum and your baby is drinking that is often sufficient for the first couple of days. And I just say often just because there are situations where, the baby's going to be nursing, and they're not getting anything. And, it just kind of goes downhill from there. But you do have milk. It's just that it transitions to the mature milk, around, for some people, it's day 3 or 4, some it's 24 hours. Often when you have more babies, it's sooner, but it's not going to be, you don't have to feel like you don't have milk until the 5th day and your baby's starving in most situations.
Yeah. And the beauty of it, that is the entire time your baby's growing, your milk's changing the whole time. It's just not as noticeable because colostrum looks kind of I don't know, what do you call it?
It's thick. It's just
mucus.
Thick and yellow. Yeah, I would say that's probably a good description of it. It's really yellow. It's very thick. And actually, if you are needing to pump right after you give birth or anything like that, hand expression can be a lot easier because the pump doesn't always draw out the colostrum as effectively as, hand expression would. But it's very thick. It's in small quantities, but it's really nutrient rich. It's, what your baby needs because their stomachs are small in those first couple of days. And, the amount they need really increases pretty quickly. But that by the time that starts to happen, usually your milk has come in. And there are things you can do to help your milk kind of come in faster. So that's one thing when people are like, what can I do, to prepare or increase my milk supply? I'm like, well, not a lot before, but within those first, 24 to 48 hours, they found if you hand express right after your baby nurses within the first hour, they saw a substantial increase in your milk at 6 weeks. And it was just that first hour, hours 2, 3, and 4, they didn't see a big difference. But, doing that and lots of skin to skin and whatnot, that can really help with bringing your milk supply in more quickly.
Yeah. So when we say milk supply, probably a lot of the first time moms out there are very confused, the dairy truck come then. So when your milk comes in, it changes from that, transparent-ish texture to what you would more picture as milk. It's more white. And then your boobs get really full and firm and sometimes painful. So that's what people are going to, when they say, oh, has your milk come in yet? You're going to have that sensation, which I've never had. So I'm just explaining this like I would explain a prostate exam. Literally no idea.
No, it's super important to know that too, because the milk, and it's not just sitting there either. You will have some milk that kind of is available at any time, but the milk, it starts to be produced with, stimulation. So you have those milk glands that when, your body is saying, I need to make milk, it starts to make and produce milk while your baby's nursing. So it's a blood product. It's made. It's not just always sitting there either. Because I think sometimes we're like, oh, my milk came in and, the milk is just going to be, just sitting there all the time in your breast. And that's why some people kind of get worried, when their milk supply regulates, because at that point, you don't have as much milk, sit like just waiting to come out or whatever, because your body learns that it wants to make milk when it's being told to make milk, if that makes sense.
Right. Because no one would keep having babies if you were constantly having painful boobs. And what makes it painful? Is there milk in the mammary glands?
There is, like, sometimes if you are really engorged, it's because you have milk that's just sitting there and there's just a lot of it in the glands, just like that's just kind of waiting in the breast. So there are some in the glands that kind of just sitting there and it's just full and it starts to swell and it can cause irritation and things like that. So sometimes, we talk about clogged ducts, and that's when the milk has not been removed from those glands. That's just kind of sitting there more or less, and it starts to be inflamed. And, sometimes you'll get like those big lumps, for clogs, but it's not really, the milk isn't making that big. It's not like a big clog of milk that's like, a big, quarter size or whatever. It's actually the inflammation. The milk clog isn't that big. It's just the inflammation that's causing that pain. So a lot of times that if you're not, and the first 24 hours or so, having engorgement is pretty typical. But after that, if you are really just like super in pain, your baby's not nursing and it's just like rock hard, that's not super normal. So the first 24 hours having that fullness is 24 to 48 hours. But if you're continually having engorgement, and people think that they need to be engorged, so like, I'm not engorged anymore, did my milk go away? Engorgement isn't the goal. And, feeding on demand and regularly emptying the breast, that can actually help. Some people are like, oh, if I, let my breasts, if I don't nurse as frequently, then I won't be as engorged. But it's actually often the opposite, that, the more you nurse, the less engorged you're going to be.
Yeah, it regulates and people do worry. Although I would say that engorgement was probably my goal when I was like 16.
Mm-hmm. I'm sure, yes. One thing kind of on the same line, another myth is just that your breasts are empty after feeding. Like people are like, oh, I have to wait, or that you need to wait for your breasts to fill up. I hear that all the time. They're like, oh, I breastfed my baby and now but they're still hungry like an hour later, but my breasts haven't filled up. And at any point, your baby can take 70% of the available milk in your breasts. And then there should be more milk. But as I talked about earlier, as your baby's suckling at the breast or you're pumping, that tells your body, the milk factory, to make more milk. So your breasts aren't ever truly empty. Sometimes babies that are more used to like a fast flow, or if, they're getting a bottle and things like that, and it's just kind of not being paste fed and whatnot, that can make it so your baby's like, oh, well, I want the fast flow where it just comes in my mouth right away. So they may get fussier in those situations, but it's not necessarily because you don't have milk. And of course, there's situations where you don't have milk. Like with you were, feeding your baby around the clock and he wasn't getting, your breasts weren't making the milk that they needed to. And so in those situations that can happen. But if you're making milk and, it's regularly being produced, your breasts aren't empty. It's like you turn on a hose when you're outside, you kind of turn it on and it starts to trickle and it starts to come out, the longer it's on. So the longer you nurse, the more the milk's going to start coming out. And it's better to nurse more frequently because that encourages your body to make more milk. If you are having a long period of time between your nursing, that tells your body, oh, I don't need to make milk. So the production slows down, and it's fattier milk too, the more frequently that you nurse.
Yeah. So it's just a big old factory in there, guys. And then
it is.
Then it shuts down. You don't even use it ever again.
You can relactate if I've heard about grandmas who, they relactate for their grandchildren, which I think is kind of crazy, but so it does, but eventually, you do stop using it and, you're not going to breastfeed for the rest of your life, but it's kind of an interesting process that some people can lactate years after they stopped breastfeeding.
You always hear stories of people who just like leak all the time forever and ever. So I guess their factory never shuts off.
I know leaking is, I leaked with my first, and that's another thing. Like some people think if they're not leaking, that's a bad sign. But with my third baby, I had the most milk and I was never engorged and I never leaked. But you've seen Andrew, he's a bit of a chunk. He's slimmed down a little bit, but he was very well fed. It was clear that I had enough milk for him. It
is such a weird thing though, right? Like Hillary, circa 20-year-old Hillary, like learning about this in nursing school, and my mom didn't breastfeed. I was just like, what is going on? Like the liver was much easier to understand understand than breastfeeding.
Oh yeah, it's such a crazy process. And that's why I'm such a huge advocate for prenatal education. I was talking about this with my mentor the other day that I do consults with, and we were just talking about how, people are just really like naive when they go into it. I was the same way. Like my son was born and I remember people saying, "Oh, are you going to breastfeed?" I was like, "Oh, I don't know, probably." And then they just handed him to me and I was like, "Okay, I guess I'll breastfeed." And like, but a lot of people, it's like they just don't know. Like I was doing a consult with a mom and she just was like, "I don't know anything that's going on." And like she didn't know some of the terms that I think are pretty common, but it's just like people don't really talk about it. Even when you're in nursing school, it can be kind of complicated and you're like, this is just kind of crazy. So that kind of leads into my last myth that even if you know everything, if you've taken every class, you've met with a lactation consultant, all these things, that doesn't guarantee success with breastfeeding. And I know that sounds kind of like a downer, but I think it's important to realize that it's, you can know everything in the book and it might still, something might happen that's totally out of your control. You might hemorrhage or you might have a retained placenta and your milk supply might not come in when you want it to. And that can be really devastating, especially if you know everything. I feel like most of the lactation consultants I know say that they went into lactation consulting because they had so many problems or they had their baby and they're like, I should know everything because I'm a lactation consultant, but they still had issues. So I just don't feel like you failed if something goes wrong. A lot of times we can fix things, especially if you work with someone pretty early on, but it's just like parenting. You never know what's going to happen. You can read all the books and think you're the best parent in the world and then you still end up with a crazy child.
Yeah, I have a friend who like ninth baby was texting me and I was like, "Oh my gosh, you've had so many kids. Like how can you have a problem now?" And she was just, I think she'd actually hemorrhaged on that baby now that I think about it, but it was just like different and things just weren't happening like it normally did. So yeah. And I will say that by my third, like I had been a labor nurse 8 years and I had latched hundreds of babies on. And I will also say it is so much easier to latch somebody else's baby on than your own.
Oh, absolutely.
But, I thought I'm going to get it this time. I know so many things. I know all the things. I talked to lactation. Nope. My body was like, screw you. It just, knowledge doesn't fix everything, sadly.
I know. And it can make you feel like, oh, well, like I just have to keep trying. And like, I'm all about if a mom wants to keep trying to breastfeed and find a way to make it work for her, then I'm all about helping support that. But then it's like, sometimes it's okay if you're like, okay, this isn't working for me, or I'm done and I want to do something different. And I think sometimes it can be a little bit easier when I'm really big on people knowing all their options and being able to make that informed decision, because a lot of things are outside your control, but with the things that you do have control of, I think it's important to be able to be given those options, not just be told, well, good luck, that was a good try from you. Like now just here's some formula. And sometimes that is what you need to be told. But I think just being informed and knowing what decisions and what choices you have is really important. And just being aware of, those signs that your baby isn't getting enough or that they are. Because often I get people like messaging me and they're like, I don't think my baby's getting enough milk. They seem like they aren't. And, we go through, are they gaining weight? And they're like, oh yeah, they gained like 5 pounds in a month. And I'm like, well, they're obviously getting milk. And so often it's like, it's easy to blame breastfeeding, like, oh, they're not sleeping or they're crying, so it must be because they're breastfeeding. But often there's a lot of different, I think, pieces of the puzzle. So understanding the signs that your baby is getting enough is really important too.
Yeah. Sometimes I see dads a lot of time being like, I think it's breastfeeding, because that's nothing they have any control over. So it's not their problem.
So it's easy to blame it on breastfeeding. And I see that. I mean, I see it with dads, I see it with friends, I see it with doctors. And so it can be frustrating. So that's why it's just important to be informed as much as you can and then follow your gut. And, sometimes things just don't, like you said, with your friend that she was her 9th baby and she was having problems. And that happens. Like I was just working with someone who had 4 kids and then her last ones, like she was just having so many problems. And it is frustrating when that happens and you feel like this should be working and it doesn't. But I think that's probably the biggest myth of it all, that if you know everything, that it's just going to be smooth sailing, because really, and then sometimes people, they don't know anything and breastfeeding's super easy. That was with my first son. And I was like, I don't get why people have problems. This is so easy. And then, with my second, it was the complete opposite. So it's just kind of luck of the draw sometimes.
Yeah. And I liked how you said there's options, because sometimes, mom's just freaking out, baby's crying. And I'm like, you know what? Let's just give an ounce of formula. Everyone chill the heck out in this room. Baby, mom, like realize there are so many options here.
Mm-hmm.
And then we can like restart, because.
Yeah. And giving 1 ounce of formula isn't going, you'll hear I'm sure there's people that will be like appalled that I would say this, but it's not going to be the end of the world. Like, especially, maybe it'll change their gut flora or whatever. But like sometimes they need that formula to keep you breastfeeding. Cause I have seen that time and time again or they just need to pump and give some milk. And I've seen that over and over just because people sometimes just need it to calm down and get their baby to, get a little bit past that initial part where they're just freaking out and they don't want to breastfeed because they're just so hungry. And so I think just not thinking it's the end of your breastfeeding relationship because you have to pump or you have to breastfeed. And, we say things like, don't pump until 4 to 6 weeks. But, a lot of times you have to pump before that because you have to pump to make milk and give it to your baby. So I think always take advice with a grain of salt and know that your situation is going to be different than everyone's.
Yeah. And focus on like, what is your problem? Will the baby not latch because they're freaking out? Okay, maybe let's just give them just a tiny little bit of something, because when the baby latch freaks out, mom freaks out, then your breasts are like, then the whole factory shuts down. Willy Wonka goes out of the factory.
Yep.
And
it's so true.
Or is the problem that you need sleep? So maybe dad needs to give a pumped bottle. Like, look at what your actual problem is and see how you can fix the problem. And then instead of just being like, breastfeeding, it's just like blah, 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 here's my problem. I need sleep. How do we fix that? I need 4 hours. How can we make that happen?
Yep, I totally agree. And I just think that's super important I like how you said, look for the problem and not necessarily be like, well, it's because of breastfeeding, so I'm going to stop everything right now. And sometimes it is breastfeeding, but I think just, finding the problem and if you don't know what the problem is, talking to someone that can help you find what that problem is, because it can be hard to troubleshoot and be like, why is this baby not, when I work with a mom, I go through a list of things. Like if the baby's refusing to latch, I'm like, well, let's talk about it. Like, are they getting a bottle regularly? Or is there like something else going on? Did they look tense? Do they look uncomfortable? And, you just have to troubleshoot. And that can be tricky, especially in those first few days after you give birth, when you're in a total fog. Like even with my third, I knew just everything, but I had gestational diabetes, and it was just, everything felt like it was the end of the world. Even though I knew what I wanted to do, I felt like I just couldn't communicate that well. So just finding someone that can help advocate for you and in those types of situations is helpful too.
Yeah. I think one of the other myths I want to address is that a lot of people think they can just do it on their own. And I will say that when the listeners, moms, were breastfeeding, that they did do it alone. Like there really were not a lot of lactation consultants when I started in labor and delivery, and you kind of had to search for it. And so they found support, in other moms and stuff like that. But the good news is now you can find like an expert that can really pinpoint your problem right away, instead of asking 30 friends like what they think the problem could be. And that would just be based off of their couple people that they've breastfed. So definitely look into getting a lactation consult. A lot of times you can schedule them in the hospital even before you go home, or there's virtual ones, or there's so many good options. And if your insurance doesn't cover it, and most insurances do, is that true, Katie?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, most of them do. And there's actually a great company called the Lactation Network where they've partnered with some of the major ones, and you just put your information in. It's like a breast pump. You put your information in, and then they tell you, okay, this covers 3 lactation consults, and they'll give you a huge network of people that you can work with. So it's really, there's so many great ways to get in touch with a lactation professional these days.
Yes. So don't feel like you should be troubleshooting on your own. Yes, some basic troubleshooting. It's always going to be like troubleshooting a little bit. Are you drinking enough water? Are you getting your rest, especially right after the baby's born? But once you get beyond those basics, find a professional, because they're not expensive. If for some reason your insurance doesn't cover it, they really are not that expensive, period, if you're just paying the cash price. So I would call them and say you want to pay a cash price. That's going to be the different than the price that they bill your insurance. So sometimes that can be really affordable.
Yep, I think that that's super important. And like if you think about it, if they can solve the problem and it prevents you from having to pay whatever amount for formula and bottles and things like that, then because it can be hard, like, oh, it's like $100 or $150. That's like so much money. But in the long run, if it helps you, it is beneficial to do.
Yeah. And if you're a grandma out there or someone that's supporting a pregnant mom, think about like that would be a great option to just give them, like, you get a consult after your baby's born. That would be a great like postpartum gift, so that they know where they're going. It's somebody hopefully that matches them in personality. I will say that some lactation consultants, like, I'd look at their website and just make sure that they're a good fit for you, because some of them are definitely lactation Nazis that are like,
oh, absolutely,
you will breastfeed or die. Those are your 2 options. So,
oh yeah, I have seen that, and it's so frustrating. And I've seen that with some people that I've worked with, where they get mad at other lactation consultants that are like, well, it's okay. If you have to have formula, that's okay. If we need to do combo feeding, that's okay. Like I've seen some really brutal things being said and thrown around and being reported, to the IBCLC people just because, they're like, there are the lactation Nazi type people and it's the lactivists, I guess is what people say. And I think that there's more and more lactation consultants now that are, and this isn't always true. There's some new consultants that are kind of crazy, but I think more and more we're seeing ones that are like, okay, it's not just breast milk or formula. Like there's a lot of middle area, especially with more things coming out about low milk supply and how common it is, or because it's not like 50% of moms, but I would say, like they say between 5 and 15, that is a lot of women. So I think a lot of more lactation professionals are realizing that it's not just so cut or dry. But like you said, make sure it's a good fit, ask questions, because you don't want someone that's going to be making you feel guilty and making you think like, oh, this is just, you're a terrible, horrible mom. And yeah, I think that that's important.
Yeah. Or making choices for you. Like they should be there just to give you the options and some ideas. They're not telling you what to do. That's your baby's job to tell you what to do.
Mm-hmm. It's true.
All right. There are so many breastfeeding myths. I totally recommend people get a class. Katie has her classes up on her. What is the name of the actual classes, Katie?
So I think it's breastfeeding boot camp. That's more of like an essentials class. And then I have a pumping class that I think it's called like empowered pumping. And I have some that are like just smaller ones that are just about preparing to breastfeed and preparing during pregnancy. So you can get those on my website. The names might change a little bit from the time of this podcast, but I also offer them with the Breastfeeding Mama Academy, which includes everything. Like it includes all of the classes. It includes live Q&As. It's really an interactive option for moms to support you from pregnancy through weaning, because often, even though there's not a lot of breastfeeding support, like in general, there's more in the beginning. And then the older your baby gets, the less and less support there is. So my goal is to provide a place for people to get support throughout their entire breastfeeding journey.
Yeah. So you'll find her at the Breastfeeding Mama, and I will put the link to the best class for pregnant moms. Katie will give that to me before the show goes live, and then you guys can pick that one up and get started, because it is important. And I like share like 3 little tidbits about breastfeeding in my prenatal class. It is not focused on breastfeeding. And I don't think most prenatal classes and breastfeeding classes are usually separate, because people that are prepared in delivering babies are usually not that great at breastfeeding. I mean, they might have been good breastfeeders, but you kind of have to concentrate on what you're good at. And mine is not boobs. So
there's experts for everything. So
that's right. All right. Thanks for coming on, Katie.
Yes. Thank you so much.
Okay. Like I said at the beginning of the episode, I had 100% drunk the breastfeeding will go fine juice before I had my baby. And I don't know. Honestly, was I that prepared? I worked for a pediatrician, so I kind of thought like I would know all the things, but I didn't. And I think it's just so important to go in and getting prepared. So I 100% recommend taking a prenatal class and a breastfeeding class. Katie's and mine mesh really well. We have very similar ideas about parenting and breastfeeding and stuff like that. So I would just totally recommend both of them. I think I have a coupon code if you do both. I will put that in the show notes as well. So thanks again for coming on, Katie, and I hope you guys enjoyed it. Do not miss next week's episode where my mom is coming on. We're going to talk all about raising this curly-headed little girl and how my life is different than maybe she thought it would be when I was a teenager. Thanks so much for joining us on today's episode. We know you have lots of options for your ears, and we are glad that you chose us. We drop episodes weekly, and until next time, we hope you have a tangle-free day.